Jason's webinar. His time with us is very special. We are able to do this because we're funded South Carolina Middle Grades Initiative, partners with the South Carolina University of South Carolina, and they fund our initiatives. And so we always want to give a shout out to them. Our organization is called Literacy in the Disciplines 612. And right now we have about 11 educators on it from various higher ed institutes and classroom teachers and instructional specialists. And so we feel like it's a good group to have input from to develop ways to support teachers in the classroom. Jason is with us tonight, and he is a passionate educator and actively engaged in finding what works for connecting readers with literacy practices. He earned his PhD from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and his teaching experience ranges from middle grades, university level in Tennessee and North Carolina. Right now, he teaches high school students in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Jason is widely published, one of which is Building Critical Literacy and Empathy with Graphic Novels, and we hope he's going to share his expertise with us through his presentation tonight. He has also edited and written articles and posts for many publications, including Routledge, English Journal, and the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. Jason, take it away.
You so much. Absolutely. I'm delighted to be in this room. I think we have fellow educators. We have a few folks from the comics community as well. We have, I think, at least one author in the mix. So delighted to be talking about comics and connecting. I believe my title of the talk is slightly different, just because of something, but some of the things that I've been thinking about lately and some of the pieces that have been impacting my practice. But there is my name, the letters that come after it, as well as the handle for Instagram, if you would like to choose to engage and hear me talk and run my mouth even more. The title is Streams of Meaning, Comics, Media, and More. So comics are a central part of what we're talking about tonight. And being a relatively small group in person, hopefully we can build some lovely conversation as well as some reflection. And if you're joining us via the recording, thank you for listening. And I hope to share some words that are helpful. I'll share a little bit about my background and some of the things that I've been thinking about, some of the concepts that I continue to work through that continue to challenge me in education. As was part of the bio, I'm currently teaching high school. This is my rep. I have the gear on, mostly because I didn't have time to change on the way into the house today, but also because I'm part of a lovely school community. I have wonderful leadership, wonderful students. There might even still be a little bit of a smiley face drawn on my nose. I don't know. I tried to get it off on the drive-in, but I had a student who was drawing a smiley face on my nose today. So there is drawing that happens in my classroom. Being a comics fan and someone who believes strongly in multimodal literacy and multimodal practices, although it's not always on my face. Today was just that special kind of day. I started out as a middle school English teacher. Actually, my background is in ministry and religion and things like that. And I found that the voice that I wanted was much more in the classroom than in other spaces in society. So I made my way in 2007 to the middle school classroom. I instantly found that material like comics were highly engaging. I tell this story in the book, and I've told it in a couple of places, but you're always looking for connections with students. And my first initial experiences with that were bringing in traditional literature, the highly valued canonical texts that have been passed down from generation to generation, John Steinbeck and some of these things. And I found that my students didn't immediately connect with authors from 100 years ago or more, but I did find that they were really interested in whatever Robert Downey Jr. was doing in the Marvel universe or whatever the current CW show happened to be. And I found that when there were comics that were added to my classroom library, they were often checked out and not returned, which I consider to be a compliment to the medium. So from my middle school experience as a teacher, I began a path teaching at the college level and spent about 7 years part-time and full-time working on my PhD. That was the first 4 years. I was a full-time professor for 3 years and continue to profess and work with colleges and universities whenever I can. And gained experience there working with students that were interested in anywhere from upper elementary on. And currently, I do teach at the high school level. So I've had this strange experience of getting to visit all of these theories, all of these ideas, think a lot, share with students that are getting ready to teach students, and then try it out myself, which is very daunting. It's very daunting, but also a lot of fun at the same time. And in terms of where I stand on some of the issues with multimodality, the kind of communications that students embrace, I've learned that I'm somewhere between Generation X and Millennial, based on my 1982 birth date. I'm somewhere in between, so I do remember computers and technology in the classroom. I remember access to lots of different ways of creating, certainly video games and telling stories that way. My school experience, again, as I mentioned in the book, did not include a lot of comics, although I did stay home as often as possible so that I could stay home and read comics and act out stories with action figures and other such things. I was also raised by boomers, so this fits somewhere into this pie chart of identity and the intersections of identity as it relates to generation. Uh, and it gives me some nice flexibility, I think, in fostering connections. I also identify as a person who is a member of fandom. I'm someone who's always been interested in writing and creating. I can remember sitting at a kitchen table much like the one I'm sitting at right now, as a child, and drawing out stories and creating characters. One day planning to be a superhero. I've since, sort of given up on the dream to be a superhero, but there's still hope. We know that we live in drastic times, so there's certainly still hope. But one of the things that I've been able to do, one of the works that I've engaged in the past few years, is autoethnographic work, looking at my story and the way that it's been shaped by comics and that instant connection to media that I think is so vibrant right now and has been for some time and continues to be. We continue to have multiple channels that our students have access to. And once more, if you're interested in hearing me talk to people in the literacy community, scholars, authors, creators, I've started a podcast program in the past few years, which has been a really nice experience also for triangulating some of the things that I've been thinking about and hearing the experience of other people and how comics and fandom and reading and creating have been introduced to them. So these intersections of fandom, creating scholarship, continue to drive the things that I'm interested in, the work that I'm interested in doing. And on a daily basis, as someone that gets to interact with around 70 young people, give or take, it's also helpful in fostering connections and connections that I think are authentic and pretty organic to the areas of interest that I have. So I start out with the old man on the porch argument, the notion that there's some means of communicating that is destroying communication as it stands. This idea that the end is the beginning and it is the end. And currently, I think TikTok gets the highest rating. I don't hear quite as much pushback on Snapchat. Maybe people don't know what it is. I don't know. But TikTok currently has the focus for these thoughts of, is it destroying a generation of thinking? I grew up in, as I mentioned, the video game age of, these kids are just playing video games, it's mindless, and all of those sort of things, all of those sort of concerns. And so this always raises the question. I mentioned canonical texts. How do our meaning making practices change? We use reading and writing in many similar ways from text type to text type, but when you think about the work that students are doing or the things, the materials that really gather their interest, what are those screens? What are those avenues? Usually it's whatever is pushed back on, ironically, because there is that part of nature that seems to push back on the standard. And if the adults are saying don't do it, it becomes that much more interesting and alluring. And so the text combination of what happens on TikTok is really interesting to me and operates in its own multimodal way. I continue to have students who are also interested in comics, either through web comics. We were having a brief conversation before we hit record about manga and how in France there's this tradition that is upheld. It's very much a central focus of culture and scholarship there, the bande dessinée tradition, and this idea that stories and complex stories can be told not just with words, but with words and images. It's something that's pretty fundamental to what makes comics work, as well as other media, and you can add in gestures, sounds, other forms with digital media, certainly. And this all makes me think about how we prioritize texts and voices over one another. There are certain ways of communicating that maybe get the focus in state standards policies that don't get questioned as often as just assumed that if I'm looking at a book, I have a J.R.R. Tolkien book right here. If I'm just looking at this, it's assumed that I'm getting more out of that than if I'm scrolling through something that's in more of a digital format. Maybe, maybe not. It really depends on some of those critical components of what's actually happening when I'm looking at the page and how I'm engaging with that. Those are conversations that I think happen in classrooms most saliently when we take time to talk with students and understand a little bit about their processing. And in the continued age of book bans and thinking about material that gets pushed back on and resisted, the idea of prioritizing some voices over others is certainly salient in that way as well. So we have lots to think about. In addition to the fact that the kids that I work with are not purely digital. It's not as though there's a Neo from the Matrix baby that is just adept at all screens, nor is it the case that kids even like doing everything digitally. Some of my students really like taking breaks from the screen quite often. The gaming notion of what happens on a cell phone is highly engaging, but once they've been looking at screens for a while, I have several students who, again, will draw on my face. Or actually, they tend to prefer to use dry erase markers and draw on desks, which, being a person who embraces creative arts and expression, I allow as they're working and as they're listening and as we're engaged in literacy work, getting a lovely koi fish drawn on my desk is not a bad way to spend a day, especially since it can be erased. Although there are times that I wish I could sort of like lacquer over it because it's certainly much more attractive than a school desk, and not comfortable by any means, but you get a nice picture in any case. So it's not as though we're just applicationing our way and apping our way to happiness either. Now, as I've alluded to, we've seen the pushback on what kids readily engage with before. It goes back to 1954, Seduction of the Innocent, and it goes back before that, well, before that. But in terms of comics and thinking about uh, the material that students engage with and that people engage with, comics were one of those areas of pushback. This was the Comics Code Authority time and led to many, many years of kids only comics. Thus, we now have a bit of a reputation for comics still for people that don't read them as though they're all for kids or all for a particular audience. It's the same as tasting one type of food and thinking, well, this is just food. That's all this is. It's just food. So, Frederick Wortham did some shoddy research in Seduction of the Innocent and has a lovely title. It reminds me of sort of a soap opera title, but nevertheless, contributing to this conversation of the kids are just doing these things that are destroying their minds. And I put the question on the screen that I actually think is more concerning. What's the danger of not reading at all? When I think about the people that I've met in my life that are most destructive to healthy dialogue, that are perhaps some of the more contentious voices. They're not the people that I tend to find that read comics or read a particular medium, other than maybe what happens across an algorithm. And so there's that critical notion of thought that we have to be reading. We always have to be reading and thinking, and reading and thinking, this critical idea of circling around questions and gaining experiences that are like us and not like us, something that is certainly part of my passion for literacy. But also, when you think about the visual and verbal components of comics, we can read about a person's experience. We can also see some of that drawn out. We can see the artist's interpretation. We can see their background, culture, and ideas represented not only in the story and the way that it plays out, but in the images, sometimes in the color design. Thinking about The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. Lots of wonderful texts out there and lots to dig into. So, admittedly, part of what I do is nostalgia teaching, and I've talked a good bit, so we do have a few thought experiments for you to try out at home as well. I continue to engage in the material that I have enjoyed for years. I just recently began a rewatch of He-Man, which is not the most inclusive of names, of course, and the Masters of the Universe. And He-Man over here was, in terms of marketing, great for action figures. Wonderful for action figures. I'm pretty sure that the animated series was a big commercial for the action figures, but certainly material that I readily engaged with. And I don't know how many fans of He-Man or She-Ra there are in the room, but I know that at the end of every episode, just like in Full House, if you haven't seen it, it's on Amazon. You can go and even fast forward to this part. There's a character education moment where He-Man comes in and says, "Today's episode was all about this, and this is kids what you can do at home." Uh, so of course I don't remember that from my childhood, but I remember it from the rewatch. This was a way of whitewashing He-Man. Not that He-Man needed much whitewashing as it was, but also sort of making it palatable and making it okay to give these animated episodes to children to validate their presence in media, and thus to create lots of action figures and play sets, which you can still find in stores now, because it's all coming back. It all comes back. The power of nostalgia. Now, when I share pieces of information with students like this, sometimes students know what I'm talking about. Sometimes students have new material that they're engaging with, but there's usually some thread. Sometimes students have an idea that they're circling around with manga or some media that I am not familiar with. And the fact that I am a fan and I go to conventions and I talk with creators and I bring pictures back, uh, it gives me a little bit of an insight into what my students are interested in, not necessarily because we always like the same things, but because the conversation then happens in slightly more open ways. So, this all to say, I embrace all in my reading life at home as well. And when thinking on this and reflecting, the idea of my growth as a reader and how it didn't necessarily happen with just the school branded materials has informed a lot of my pedagogy. It involves a lot of my practice and the theory that informs that practice. So, what's it like now for teens developing ideas? Well, it turns out that there are narrative trends on TikTok and in other forms of media. There are uh, direction demonstrations that occur in TikTok form. There are identity formation pieces that happen across media, I would say, because we're always searching for belonging. We're always looking at representations. And there's also the idea of this memory as meaning making. So we have these literacy histories. We pass down the things that we enjoy. Is it any wonder that my dad enjoyed comics, that my mom readily engaged with comics and read to me as a kid? Is any of that really surprising? Not necessarily. And I had other family members that would engage in media with me. It was a communal practice, as is so often the case. Now, when we're thinking about ourselves and our students, we live at this lovely sort of nexus, this hub of all of these pieces of information that are coming together. So much so that if I look up a single element on my phone, or if I even buy something on Amazon, or if I say it out loud near my phone, I think my phone is listening to me because I immediately or within a few days get all sorts of content that's geared in a particular direction. So, what is the role of the individual? Let's bring out the Emerson question here. Do I resist media? Do I resist branding? How do I even do that? Or do I engage in creative subversion? I feel like students run that range between freely accepting trends and that notion of being alike by being different and being different by being like everybody else. And at the same time, I also have students that interestingly engage with older media as they're constructing their identity, and they kind of play with that. This is the student who's wearing a band shirt that I talk with, and I say, "Oh, I love that band. Oh, I just like the shirt." There's a little subversion in that as well. Um, so of course, referencing James G here and the idea of the identity kit. There are these brands, these pieces of culture that we attach ourselves to, that we think about. And for our students, that can mean engagement. Sometimes, if we're misusing it, it can mean disengagement. It can mean frustration. And sometimes it just means that we get to sit back and enjoy what our students are talking about and doing. And we don't necessarily have to understand the 6-7 trend. We just allow it to happen as it did yesterday in an auditorium full of elementary students where I was in attendance. Uh, so it's interesting, nevertheless. Now, as our thought experiment, our first thought experiment for you to think about at home, you're certainly welcome. Are we chat enabled? Is that something that we're doing?
We are chat enabled, and we are also break room enabled if you need breakout rooms.
Chat.
Oh, fantastic. We have all of these wonderful affordances. Have you considered your brand? My goodness, what a corporate question is that? By brand, I mean these materials that you surround yourself with, the identity that you present, the pieces of your life that you present, because we all have parts of us that we leave at home. We all have parts of us that, if we're in classrooms or if we're in other professional spaces, we kind of move those out front while others move to the back. Some of our brand or identity, or however you want to frame it, is sacred, and our identity is separate from our brand in many cases, and also informed by the things that we support and engage with. So, any thoughts on this notion of branding that you'd like to share? You're certainly welcome to do that in the chat. And co-facilitators, I'm not looking at the chat, but if we have something that streams across, I would welcome some sharing before I continue to share from my experiences and talk about the things that have informed me.
Okay.
And for those of you looking for where the chat is with WebEx, a lot of you might not be used to it. There's a list in the at least on mine, it's in the bottom right. And you have to make sure you're on the everyone, because when you get to the chat, there's an everyone or a direct message option.
Since the pandemic, we also have this lovely like webinar branding where some people do Zoom, some people do Google Meets, some people do WebEx. Some people have upgraded editions of the streaming platforms. Being someone who's engaged with media and podcasting, I know podcasters who um, create within one particular brand and share that because of the access that it affords. I'll be quiet for just a moment to catch my breath, and then if there's anything on branding that anyone wants to share, thinking here again about the work of James G. and identity formation.
I kind of feel like my brand is being an educator, encourager. I find
Mm.
myself lifting people to, adding something else to what they already know, to bring them up. But I mostly think about what I do with my grandchildren is, they present with what they have, and I build on it to um, add to their knowledge. We were doing sight words, and all of a sudden I thought, well, if you put two sight words together, you get a compound word. So I'm going to teach her a compound word, and she's 6 years old. I just
Mhm.
feel like I'm encouraging through education to just continually grow in knowledge and your ability to process.
That is a lovely brand. That redefines brand, I think. I love that. It's, by
Thank
the way, the National Day of Kindness, in case you were curious about that as well. But it sounds
Okay,
like you
Ryan is
participate
sharing
in
with
that
us.
every day.
Yeah, Ryan is sharing with us that branding would apply to personal representation in marketing or pitching projects. Brandon
Mhm.
is personally Robert Crumming it
Uh-huh.
as a full-time creator.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to engage with comics. If you're looking at like Bande dessinée and some of those traditions, first of all, scheduling is interesting because you're presenting usually in the middle of the night since it's international time. And so you might be sitting at 3 in the morning looking at examples of R. Crumb work and some really interesting kind of subversion that happens there and pushing those boundaries of culture. I think sometimes my students are not aware of the coolness that is out there in comics at the same time, nor would it probably be sanctioned for me to share some of it with them. Uh, thinking about the first person that shared this idea of like a grandparent who's sharing this literacy experience takes me back again to thinking about how grandparents, parents, these are all members of like community in some way that inform where we go with our reading practice and where we go with writing practice and creating, which then, as Ryan mentioned, for folks in the professional comics community, informs the creative direction. Uh, which always, the first question I ask when I'm talking with someone in a creative field is always, "How did you get into this? What was the igniter for you?" Because as an educator, that's one of the great questions we can ask, right? Like, you've been on this lifelong path of creativity. What happened in your
Is
childhood or your young adulthood
how
that led
many
you on this
people how many people have honestly told you it's sheer insanity?
path? Not many, not many, a few.
'Cause
Yeah.
that
Usually
is
there's like
definitely
a,
my case.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna that is definitely my case. Like there you don't end up with a whole group of like family and friends that are pushing you to get into it as a career. You gotta be pretty bullheaded to say in 2025 I'm a cartoonist. Like a lot of people look at you like your head's not screwed on right. And they're probably right.
Now, as an educator, I always love when I hear someone say, "Oh, there was this art teacher." That's happened a few times. It's not always the case, but that passion and that drive, even when you have folks in your life that maybe don't embrace the artistic direction of work, uh, there's something there, right, for all of us. There's something there that connects with us in some way, be it a person or a text or some combination of the person that introduced you to this text.
Oh, well, I know personally, like for me, Dave Sim I know he's a very contentious person to bring up when it comes to sequential art, just due to his own personal politics. But as far as like what that man built and him building a company and the fact that he did control the entire thing inside of himself, I mean, it was a little after Crumb's time, but just that he went 300 comic books. He published one book a month, all as like a solo show. I think he had two other people that worked with him, and he did that for 38 straight years and ended up with 300 issues. And he wrote a book on how he built it at Cerebus Guide to Self-Publishing. And you've probably read it, but he wrote a book on how he built it and then how it basically laid out over the years looking at it in retrospect. And it was just so bulletproof in like its conception as to this leads to this leads to this. Like it looked so like it held such water, but it was also written with this uh, I can't think of a better word than like it was insanity. It was like the passion, the single mindedness of the man, where he's like he did a fair bit of it. You could tell the way he was reading it. It's almost it's a combination of like through spite, but like also I've already made up my mind like this is what I need to do with my life kind of thing. And it was just I don't know. There's something romantic about it. I guess is the best way to put it without throwing in all these negative adjectives attached to the thing. We'll go with romantic. Yeah, yeah.
Romantic is a great one, and it's what what causes someone to fall in love with creating or communicating, what causes a person to really drive after that. uh, Always thinking about these implications for teaching, always thinking about this network of what you can open students up to. We of course have the digital network that is framed up there through that image, but rapid fire imagery and engagement with storytelling across multiple forms. This goes back to my teacher education program, watching Gwen Stefani music videos. Does anybody remember when the music video for Holla Back Girl came out? Does anybody want to hazard a trivia question guess? I'm really trying not to sing it, by the way. I just know it's playing in my mind at the moment.
It's playing
Any
in my
guesses as
mind
to
too. But early 2000s.
that? Yeah, 2004. Yeah, that idea, I remember being in a philosophy
Yeah,
of education
Christine has
class.
it right in the chat.
Oh, nice, nice. A fan, a spot on fan. Um, there's been this idea of I can't compete with media as an educator, nor should I want to compete. I mean, as interesting as I can try to be, I'm just a guy with a beard and a sweater. Um, that's, and I can use humor and I can bring my personality to it, but I don't necessarily know that it's as much about the competition as noticing what's critical, noticing uh, again, as Ryan was saying, this romance, this passion, this sense of thriving creation that's within something that really we would want that for all of our students in our content areas. And I think that if we consider our paths, unless we're educating because this was sort of the thing that made sense at the moment, there's probably been some experience that's led us into the space that we're in, some bit of passion that someone built. I'm thinking about the teacher that looked at me and said, Jason, you're really good at writing. You should think about writing in some way. And I had already been writing and thinking about writing, but just to have someone say that, notice that, help me find some ways to explore getting published as a middle school student. Those connections can come pretty early. And I also point out the global affordances of something like all of the pieces that are up in the corner. There is the negative. There are the terrible stories of engaging with social media and what social media does. And admittedly, there are a few up there that I'm not familiar with, and at least one that I have an account on that I never use. But there are also these ways of connecting with fandom and community creators, and also sharing what we create. There have been people that have shared their work digitally. Thinking of Zoe Thorogood, this amazing YA creator who was sharing on Instagram, I believe, during the pandemic, and is now like an Eisner winner with what she's created. So, um, the additional implication for teaching, again, is sometimes we do, I guess it's the researcher part of me, is sitting back and watching and observing what students are doing. Any way that I engage with current media is usually done through uh, my approach of satire, which is getting it slightly wrong on purpose so that my students can laugh at me for good reasons. Sometimes my students laugh at me for reasons that I would rather not have, like tripping over something or messing something up, because I am human. But uh, intentionally getting things wrong is an engagement that I greatly delight in. And as I mentioned in the post that goes with this presentation, I had a student tell me a month or two ago, you spend too much time online. Because anytime my students say something or bring up an idea, of course I'm going to go Google it. Of course I'm going to go find out what it is. I'm going to find out what this new term is. And then I'm going to think about ways that I can either connect it or disrupt it or have fun with it and intentionally get it wrong. Because humor is part of my approach. It's part of my quirkiness as an educator. And this gets to the idea that I think is at the core of what I'd like to share about what we're sharing across screens, and that is this deep value of authenticity. It is perhaps a thing most rare, but we also have, thank you, Gandalf. We have the hope of some radical authenticity as well. And I think that as educators, as people in authoring communities, I think most of the people in this room are authoring in some way, either through scholarship, prose. There's at least one editor in the room that has anthologies out. And hi, by the way, and great to talk with you the other day. And comics and all of these ways of connecting story and who we are. This is an authentic voice reaching out to another voice and trying to build an authentic connection in some way. So just curious, as a second thought experiment, how do we define authenticity? And am I off base in thinking it's possibly the most or one of the most critical components of a teaching connection and a literacy connection across any content area? And how on earth do you practice it? I have my own middle-aged answers to that question, but curious what anyone would offer as we round out our talk.
I would
And will
think
we get that oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would think, the purpose of this group is to push literacy in authentic ways. So if you're truly practicing disciplinary literacy, you are learning to read, write, speak, think in an authentic way.
Mhm. Love that this connects with the purpose of the group as well. I think that connects with some of the work that some of us have done together. Anything else that anyone wants to add on that?
I put mine in chat, but authenticity to me, it means, showing up and not just who I am and what's important to me, but speaking that out and supporting that. All of that is shaped by my vulnerability, but also willingness to learn with and from other people through that idea of caring about people and how do we move forward together. And I do agree it is one of the most important things when it comes to education, but also just being a human.
Mhm. It makes for a more peaceful life, doesn't it? At least in many ways. This also, I think it leads to the ability to have complex, controversial conversations, sometimes with young people. Um, Rochelle, you and I have done work around difficult conversations or maybe challenging conversations in classrooms. And if you've not kind of visited who you are and what you believe, and if you've not met some people that have challenged you and kind of questioned yourself in some ways, it can be difficult to have an open conversation about politics or race or ethnicity or any number of issues. Um, but it's also, again, just part of being authentic and being willing to include a range of literature, include a range of voices, and allow those voices to exist together, or not even allowing those voices to exist together, but acknowledging that they do exist together. So finally, as we move toward the last section of the talk, we have scholar in the room who's currently working on implications for complexity, criticality, thinking about what text complexity means. Those of us that have been through the Common Core era of teaching probably have a little PTSD from seeing this diagram. I've been to 745 meetings talking about the qualitative and quantitative aspects of text and reader and task and all of those pieces that come together, and some really interesting research that's come out about what really qualifies as complex and challenging. Of course, I'm now thinking this pyramid existing in 2025 is more of, if we go back to the image that I had back here, more like this, most likely as we think about complexity, voice, perspective, modes, and we'll try to give a glimpse of what this might look like in comics as well. But just thinking about the fact that engaging with a particular character or a particular genre means that we're engaging across different ways of storytelling, and that we have kind of an algorithmic way of thinking now. So any avenue, any direction that we travel in is going to connect us to additional pieces, maybe community, maybe isolation, but some kind of connection and nexus there from something that we evidence interest in to something else. And I think there's still value in thinking about, especially qualitatively, what makes a text complex, what makes a conversation rich and deep. I think it's much more human than a pyramid, and maybe much more complicated. But I'm also thinking about the fact that, again, holding up my traditional prose novel here, this is a constrained experience. I start on page one at a particular section of the page. I then travel to the end of that line before I travel to the next. Media doesn't seem to work this way in all cases. Comics don't seem to work this way in all cases. There's kind of a path that I go on as a reader, but I also have some agency. It wouldn't make sense for me in a prose book to start at the right side of the page, for example. I do read the last part of the book sometimes first because I'm more interested in craft and how authors actually accomplish what they're after, plus I'm impatient. But there's this agency that we can have. We can scroll past it. We can right or left swipe it. We can like it. We can share it, and all of those sort of ways that we can engage. Or we can create our own spaces, which students are engaging with, and of course traveling to apps that then adults don't know about, which is part of the fun. To quote a student from a few years ago, more than a few years ago now, our moms are on Facebook. So this is what I think of when I think about reading across the modes. I've used this image before as we think about the signs, the symbols and associations, and what comics can open up. This is Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz, and it's not necessarily an image that I would start with. I've actually started with more like science comics and shown images from science comics because they include some narrative, they include some information, and then you can really dig into what's there. And I found that talking through complexity that way with students with something like a comics page shapes a little bit of what they're thinking about with the macro text and microtext and all of those pieces that are happening in any kind of reading that they do, thinking about authorial intent and purpose. So any reaction to this page, Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz. What does it mean for complexity? I know
Here's
where
something I
to.
just kind of thought.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, something I just kind of thought of. A question for you, Jason, because I'd never really considered. I'm surprised we didn't have this conversation before. But I know for me, one of the reasons why I lean toward a more like visual medium when it comes to trying to communicate this way is
Mm.
just my weakness in descriptive writing. Like I was a writer well before I ever became a cartoonist. But have you ever noticed through exposing like younger people or students to like a graphic medium where the descriptive aspect of it is being held visually in front of you, them either by noticing the subtraction or forcing the addition into it later, like, does that influence someone developing their ability to develop descriptive writing? You know what I mean? Like, is there any
Mhm.
sort of interrelationship there that you've noticed?
I mean, I think that is there to explore. I've had students ask if they can draw things, if they can represent ideas. I've also had students with complex communication needs that have shared in multimodal ways through creating, painting, drawing. There is something to that. And often, as an educator, I've used kind of the approach where you show an image and then you tie it to words and describe it. But I think what students are doing with media is also giving some practice in that pretty naturally and organically of considering how an image represents an experience. I was again in an auditorium with a bunch of young people yesterday, and they were watching a performance and noticing how on their cell phones, occasionally one would pull out a meme and show it to someone else. I had no idea the connection they were making to something that was happening in the performance, but they were doing that through an image. So I don't know that that completely answers your question. I also think there's some nice, rich work there to do in thinking about how students communicate. It's certainly interesting to watch. Any other responses on this before we conclude in the next few minutes? I would also recommend Unflattening by Nick Susanis, which is a dissertation in comics form if you really want to show a complex image. Uh, and any image, I mean, any form of comics can be used. I don't necessarily start with these. Again, I use science comics and sometimes superhero comics if I have students that are connected to that form of storytelling already. I also have students who actively resist superheroes. I mentioned at the beginning of class in many cases that I'm a comics fan, and I had a student a few years back raise her hand and say, "We're not going to be reading those superhero books, right?" And it's like, no, we don't have to read superhero books. I mean, sure, there's lots of iconography and illusion that we can explore with Superman essentially being a Moses figure, but we don't have to go there. We can go through multiple routes. So, just very quickly, I'll mention this idea of once again tying to authenticity, identity, and the algorithm. And I love this metaphor for thinking about information across literacies as well and information across disciplines because when I go into my computer, when I go into my cell phone, if I hit one web, evidently something else, someone else is watching me. It's probably Elon Musk. And catching that moment where I express interest. When I really noticed this, it was Reels on Facebook because again, I'm middle aged, and I started looking at something about an animal one day, and then all of a sudden, I got all of these distressing reels of spiders and crazy animals, and it was disturbing. And I didn't even want to look at social media for a while, and not for the reasons that I typically don't want to look at social media. It was because of like all of these insects and creatures. And then I traced it back, kind of like you do in a dream. And I thought, well, I looked that up and saw a video. Oh, yeah, okay, all right. So just thinking about this as far as an internet space, but I mentioned at the beginning, and I love the thinking that we're talking about of having a student engage with something in an image to help their descriptive skills, or maybe pulling in uh, a mode or a means of storytelling as a way to express something, explore something, understand something about themselves. Also thinking about this as a map of a school or a community where the way that one teacher interacts with another teacher affects another student, and how we're really many of us are having so many of the same kinds of conversations. We're after the same sort of goals. I think that's a nice call for collegiality as well, and just thinking about those conversations that exist naturally. If you're teaching something that connects in themes, or teaching something that connects with a student in a particular way, having the, again, I'm kind of a zennial here, but having the flexibility to allow a student to explore something that helps them inform the curricular decision in some way. They actually get to be a voice in the curriculum and in their reading and sharing. Imagine that. So in the future, we of course have Dr. Doom. Comics continue. I think they'll be here for some time. I certainly hope so and think so. We have kind of a networked literacy of affiliation. We position ourselves in certain ways. I positioned myself at the beginning talking about my education experience. And we also have this idea of agency, the way that we choose to interact on the world around us. One of the ways that I do that is through comics, as a part of my authentic interests. Um, but I continue to explore what multimodality, what sharing, writing, composing means, thinking about how literacy grows. I don't know that I suppose it changes, but it certainly grows. And remember this, hey, can we get a poster of this? We can at least be in part the authentic self interacting with a community of selves, building authenticity. I think that's the self journey here in some way, of speaking again to that notion of authenticity. And that takes us down to just a few minutes for anything about how we might be critical, compassionate together, any questions that have been left unanswered. We have slightly less than 10 minutes, about 7 minutes, if there's anything that anyone wants to add to the conversation. And I do speak
And while
APA.
you do Q&A, Jason, for our
Mhm.
organization, I'm putting the feedback survey in the chat that they don't have to take at the moment. I just want to put it in there since you had a good transition. But yes, we are open for Q&A for Jason. Please feel free to unmute if you have a question or a thought, or you can put it in chat as well. This was a
I'll
remarkable
travel back over
presentation.
to the. Thank you. I have you on a separate tab, so I just moved back over to make sure that I've got that. And if not a question, anything that I said that connected is also, of course, more than welcome.
I wanted to mention something put in the chat. She was talking, we were talking about branding. She was talking about how teachers develop a brand for their classroom. So Catherine, I just, what would you say your brand for classroom was? Students approach you with it.
I think you can hear me, right? Good. Okay. So I think the brand I've tried to build in my classroom is, I hate to say chill because that makes it sound juvenile, but one of the things I really try to make my students aware of is that mistakes are encouraged and welcome. So when I say a chill brand, I mean, like, I'm very open and honest with my students about, like, guys, I'll be so honest, I'm not sure how this lesson plan is going to work, but I hope it goes well. And by having that sort of open honesty with them, and by having that sort of quote unquote chill brand, it becomes a thing where students feel more encouraged to ask questions. They feel more encouraged to share things with me. My students have a pretty volatile sticker trade right now that they've now included me in, because I've taken time to build that chill brand where I actually want to talk to them about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Actually
I
sometimes have
think that's
students say, "Will
it
you
next
stop talking to
authentic.
us so we can actually do this?" hmm I'm also part of the Chill brand, I believe. Always talking with students, and I was just saying, sometimes I'll talk with them while they're writing something, and they have to say, "Can you give me just a minute?" Because I'm always interested in what they're thinking. Any other thoughts or pieces? I also see Christian Hines in the space. We're working on editing an Allen review right now that deals with comics and multimodality.
Jay, a lot of comments scroll in the what people have to say.
Oh, and thank you, Jason, for the compliment. I also had to run to the courthouse in between. The caffeine is a beautiful thing.
And we'll stay on for a few more moments. If you have questions or thoughts that you want to share with Jason, I see lots of people are having to duck off. But Jason, thank you. This was great, as everybody's agreeing in the chat. The feedback surveys in the chat, as well as if you need CEUs or professional development credit, there's a link there as well. But we'll stay on for about 2 more minutes if anybody has questions or wants to connect with Jason a little bit more. That sounded funny, but y'all know what I meant.
Thank you, Jason.
My pleasure. And if anyone has a question that comes up later,